Great rewards don't wait, so why should you? Through the Invigor Book and Buy Grower program, you could earn a $30 per bag rebate when you book all of your Invigor hybrid canola by November 14th. Talk to your retailer. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, my name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin our discussion today, I want to acknowledge that I am participating in this webinar from Ottawa, Ontario, located on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. As an organization, we recognize that there are many steps on the road to reconciliation, and it is a journey we must all take together. Canadian agriculture and food faces big challenges with the potential for very different solutions that lead to very different outcomes for the sector. Dialogue and debate is essential to getting better policy outcomes. Instead of shying away from thoughtful debate, we think we should embrace it. To advance CAPI's mission of advancing policy solutions, the Ag Policy Exchange webinar series offers a platform for respectful debate and dialogue to explore diverse perspectives on critical policy issues. Today, we are asking the question, is Canada in an ag innovation crisis? All of CAPI's work is made possible thanks to the support of partners who know that agriculture and agri-food can do more, and that policy plays a critical role in unlocking the sector's potential. Today's webinar was funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnerships Agri-Competitiveness Program. We are pleased that this webinar is part of our ongoing partnership with RealAgriculture. Working together, we're excited to bring more of these conversations to people working on farms, in industry, in civil society, and in government across multiple platforms to contribute to a more competitive, sustainable, and resilient agri-food sector in Canada. For more information and upcoming content, please visit realagriculture.com and CAPI's website. Today, we're going to start with a conversation between Kelvin Helpmer from RealAgriculture and Omer Kaya, CEO of Global Advantage Consulting, to set the stage for the panel discussion that will follow that I will moderate. Our three panelists are Angela Bedard-Haughn, Darcy Pollock, and Elizabeth Alika. As always, we hope that you find this a useful, thoughtful discussion and look forward to taking part in it with you. Kelvin, I'll now pass it over to you to kick off today's discussion.
Thank you, Tyler. Yes, this is a big question and something that we often talk about and discuss as part of our coverage at Real Agriculture and on Real Ag Radio. And I'm not sure whether it was Churchill that said it, never let a crisis go to waste. I know Tyler McCann has said it, used that saying before. And so the big question that we're dealing with and talking about as part of this webinar, are we in a crisis when it comes to innovation in Canadian agriculture? And looking forward to our opening speaker here. Let me read Omar's bio here. Omer Kaya is the Chief Executive Officer of Global Advantage Consulting Group, a premier consulting firm based in Ottawa that specializes in strategy, data analytics, and ecosystem transformation. With over 8 years of experience, more than 150 consulting engagements across sectors such as science, innovation, and economic development, Omer brings an internationally informed perspective and collaborative leadership that drives high-impact results across Canada's innovation ecosystem. And I think in Canadian agriculture, we often spend a lot of time in our agriculture bubble discussing challenges. So I think there's valuable perspective to be gained going outside that bubble or silo. And so, Omer, looking forward to hearing your perspective. And I guess maybe I'll let you expand on your background to start, your experience when it comes to Canada's innovation ecosystem, to use that term.
Sure. Thank you, Calvin. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for your time and listening to us. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion after as well. So in terms of Global Advantage, we work all across different sectors of the Canadian economy and also looking at international markets as well. I'm joining from Amsterdam, Netherlands today, just as part of our mission to help Canada diversify into the European markets. So having a few meetings around town here at the Amsterdam Science Park and so on and so forth. So one of their actually key focus areas that I heard from the Netherlands Enterprise Agency is focused on agriculture. So I think there's a lot of similarities and perhaps best practice to share in that space as well. When it comes to Canada's R&D innovation ecosystem, to your question, it is a $55 billion enterprise, according to the latest 2024 data. and it constitutes about 1.8% of Canada's economy from the gross domestic product perspective. And about 33 billion of that is conducted by industry. So that's the dollar magnitude, and 18.5 billion by the higher education sector. That's universities, colleges, polytechnics, CEGEPs, mostly the university sector in terms of the research intensity. Then the federal and provincial governments also conduct research internally. So although this is a lot at a smaller level, so federal government at 2.7 billion, and the provincial governments combined is around $500 million. So it is, in a way, a very uniquely imbalanced R&D ecosystem when we look at Canada, because when we compare it to OECD, which is the Organization for Economic, the economies that are comparable to Canada, the international level, there are, I think, 38 members of that. And the G7 economies, for instance, which is a smaller group Canada is a part of. Our expenditures as a nation across all sectors of the economy, including agriculture, in terms of R&D, are 33% below the OECD average. So, and the gap, according to our research, is about $26 billion per year. So for Canada to be just an average performer on R&D, and I know our key focus here is on agriculture R&D and beyond that. So just to give you this big picture perspective, we have a $26 billion a year gap when it comes to R&D expenditures in Canada across all sectors of the economy. Most of this gap comes from the business expenditures on R&D that is significantly lower than OECD average. So that's where I would emphasize our conversations and also the broader perhaps policy system to take a closer look at, to make sure that the private sector is rightfully and appropriately incentivized and mobilized so they can further invest into the R&D enterprise, which is a very key aspect of our innovation ecosystem. It's only one factor, but it is a very key factor. So that's on the R&D side. When it comes to more innovation, when we look at Canada's performance in that space, one of the key documents that we take a close look at is the Global Innovation Index. So there is the latest version of that that's been published, and Canada actually slipped in rankings in that space. Now it's 17th, and it was 14th last year. So there's a significant ascendance of developing economies, particularly in the Middle East, West Asia, and North Africa in the innovation space that we noticed. So that's besides the economies like China, Brazil, India that are also coming up quite well. So in a way, Canada seems to be falling behind and not keeping up with the competition in the innovation space. So one of the key issues in the innovation aspect is our seemingly inability to turn these innovation inputs into outputs. So that's where I believe, and my team at Global Advantage, our colleagues believe, things like knowledge translation, application, scale up, adoption, and implementation come into play. So perhaps there's additional emphasis that we should give as an ecosystem towards those areas that would complement the R&D enterprise.
I think that's some great global perspective there, Omer, in terms of where Canada fits, where our broader innovation ecosystem fits in a global context. I think many of those same factors or trends, those of us who work and breathe in agriculture, I think would say that some of those same trends are noticeable within the agriculture industry as well. Do you see certain barriers or common issues, obstacles that are causing the trends to go in that direction? The kind of the why behind why Canada is maybe 17th instead of 14th last year and that type of thing in those rankings?
Right. So there are a series of factors that influence that. So one of the fundamental, I think, questions that we should be asking in terms of the impact of the R&D enterprise is the distribution of R&D into different types of R&D. So there's basic research, there's applied research, and there's experimental development that are critical. So actually there is a key data gap, and this is a trend that we notice not only at the high national level, but also at the agricultural level. So we need to have that database, which would be useful to better understand, because otherwise the discussions and effective policymaking may be hindered to a certain extent, because we may not know exactly how we are actually allocating our R&D dollars across that space. So that's sort of a little bit more opening up of the R&D piece, but there are also other types of investments that need to complement it. Things like knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, and knowledge mobilization not in terms of only sharing the information, but also adapting to particular different context and explaining to non-academic communities so that they can actually understand the new knowledge, and then they make more use of that new knowledge that would lead into innovation. So I think there's a gap there that I noticed that could be strengthened. Another one is other types of investments that would complement R&D. So that's where we get into things like machinery and equipment, intellectual property, and collaboration opportunities that would enable people to be better connected, talking to each other, sharing with each other, and work as an ecosystem. So we work all as an individual, and we tend to work within an organization, so they seem to be rather fine. But we are, I think, just exploring the ability to work in networks and network of networks, and that ecosystem that would have the different stakeholders, flows, feedback loops, and so on and so forth that need to all work together in tandem at a time when Canada is in a very challenging situation when it comes to different aspects of our economy. Trade is one example, innovation is one example. We are talking about R&D enterprises and other challenge in that space.
So, Omer, when you talk about knowledge transfer and issues around fragmentation, are you speaking specifically about agriculture, or are you speaking about the broader Canadian innovation space? Because it
I
sounds like
think,
it sounds like what we talk about in agriculture.
yeah, so we noticed that at both levels. So when we were working with Farm Credit Canada, for instance, on the mapping of the Canadian primary agriculture ecosystem, and when we were working with the Canadian Agri-Food Automation and Intelligence Network on EdTech innovation ecosystem mapping projects, both of those we noticed there is a fairly high number of organizations, but also programs that try to support the innovation ecosystem at large, but also the EdTech and even primary ag ecosystem. We found dozens of programs. Perhaps they make the most sense. I'm not necessarily saying it's too many that we have to do something about that, but we need to make sure that it is working well and meeting the needs of the community and the targeted beneficiaries in the space. The number seems a few dozen. So just, as I mentioned about the Netherlands and RVO, there's really that one enterprise that is distributing 8.6 billion across the whole innovation continuum. We seem to be doing that in rather different types of silos and different types of program levels, that we have to make sure there are sort of points of passing the flag on to the next organizational program if we want to have that many programs and fragmentation, to make sure that there is sort of full progression and impact all the way into the key productivity gains. We need economic impact. We want trade markets, global value chains, all that are supported very well, I think, by the R&D enterprise across those three big categories of basic, applied, and experimental development. So we need to make sure that it is progressing along the way, and there are handout points across the whole ecosystem, so it really works more effectively. That's why I think trying to measure the health of an ecosystem is a growing area of interest.
We when we look at Canadian agriculture specifically, and this probably plays across the broader economy as well, but government in Canada plays a huge role in R&D and investing in innovation, especially in the early stages. And we have a government right now that is promising budget cuts, but saying that it plans to spend less, invest more, big investments to drive the economy. What do you see as maybe the role of government versus private investment? You talked about how private investment is declining or having difficulties, challenges there. Is this because Canada has the blessing and the curse of being next door to the massive market of the US, and does Canada have to have a different approach than the US on this, I guess, maybe? And I know I'm asking several different questions here, but what do you see maybe as the role of government versus private in terms of driving and improving our R&D innovation situation?
Mm-hmm. No, great question. Great series of questions. Let me start by
Series.
saying that I think the role of the government is very critical. In a way, should play even a larger role when I think about R&D, both in-house and support externally that's been provided across a time series. I think that's one of the CAPI recent studies that there is a decline in that space. One of the key roles of the government is to make sure that there is just the right amount of regulation. And that regulatory role is fundamental to make sure it is just making sure its citizens, the people in Canada are just safe from whatever necessarily may be coming. But over-regulation is a significant risk. So we want to make sure that it's all streamlined in a way that's very easy to deal with. Just to give you another example from the Netherlands, because I'm basically in a WhatsApp messaging mode with a person from the government of Netherlands in one of the ministries about a particular issue I'm trying to figure out. So it's 24 hours to turn around that I send a message comes back. And there's that level of communication. Instead of filling out a form, you wait for 2 weeks and then maybe you never hear back. I mean, those things do happen, unfortunately, not everywhere, but sometimes it does happen. So we want to make sure that there is speed of business, speed of meeting the needs of people and making sure that government, and these are public servants, these are great colleagues, I have a lot of them. So making sure that there is a bigger role they can play to make sure they are really supporting the public interest to even a greater extent. I think that is definitely needed. On one of the key issues, and this goes back to the role of the government, but also the role of the private sector, is around the productivity of the economy. So there's a recent study by FCC Thought Leadership, and I think it's released just this month, and that's talking about how agricultural productivity growth in Canada is stagnating. So this is looking at especially the last 10 years and looking into the next 10 years, and it seems to be at around 1%, not 2% anymore. So there is a portfolio of solutions that will be needed to make sure that there's a great level of productivity. And this has happened in Canada. We were more productive. So I think to the main question that we have as part of our panel and event today is we may be going towards a crisis if that's one of the big signals that I notice. And innovation is a key pillar for productivity growth that we know from, for instance, a number of economists. I think David Dodge has written a lot about that. And Peter Nicholson, for instance, talked a lot about technology adoption and diffusion of those innovations across the whole economy, including the communities that can benefit from the innovation. So that's another key area where I think both parties play a key role, both the industry and the government. So it's I see the two of them connecting at a more frequent level, a necessity going forward. So industry government collaboration will be key for solving some of these challenges.
I want to go back to your anecdote there, Omer, about being in a WhatsApp group with a government official from the Netherlands. We've seen, of course, at the political level, more talk about productivity and focus on things that turn the economy around, and there's, like you said, innovation is a pillar of that. Do you see signs of more than just talk, but action from the Canadian government right now in terms of moving in that direction, breaking a trend going the other way?
Right. I think so. I think there's a significant amount of opportunity here. For instance, FCC estimated about $30 billion of additional contribution to the economy just because if we can achieve the same level of productivity just last decade, that's over the next 10 years, we could have that kind of an opportunity. So how do we get there? I think one of the key needs that I see, and correct me if this exists, I just don't have knowledge of that, is a ambitious Canadian agri-food innovation strategy and an action plan that would basically assign all the key stakeholders that are within the levels of governments, the higher education sector, universities and colleges, private sector, all levels of them, micro businesses. This is the majority of our economy, 1 to 4 people. Small businesses up to 9, medium-sized, large business, industry, scale-up, startups, looking at nonprofits, very key role they play, I believe. Indigenous communities, significantly important to make sure they are partners in these kinds of initiatives. and also global value chains and markets. We cannot be a closed economy. We have to make sure we are diversifying, and US is still a very important market for Canada. I think that's still going to take a significant amount of time to continue to nurture that relationship and manage that relationship. So one key opportunity that I see that we can also work on within the context of a new strategy, but it's very critical that we don't take years to develop a strategy, because to the extent it is applied and action on it, then there's the value of the strategy. So really that I think fast development and moving into action space. And one of those action, I think items could be looking at the major projects. So agriculture is a pan-Canadian sector. It's across the whole map, right? It's food that connects the people. It's the only sector that has culture in it, right? So we do have, I think, that collaboration in the sector that is very, very valuable. So we can, I think, move fast on this, and then look at an area like major projects where nation building is critical. And I think those kinds of asks where we see significant investment opportunities to the sector from a major projects perspective, it's nation building within a strategy or action plan. If it lives within that, I think the reciprocity of that will be higher. To some extent, that's my concern when I look at the whole series of major projects. If they are not unlinked or unconnected in a way, then they will be siloed initiatives themselves. So just perhaps that is a key area of action that I see the whole ecosystem could take.
All right. I think that's some valuable perspective there, Omer, and that point about agriculture being having that culture of collaboration certainly is an interesting point about this too that I maybe haven't thought about when it comes to talking about the future of our innovation ecosystem. So, thank you, Omer and Global Advantage Consulting Group for participating in today's webinar. And Tyler, I'll hand it back to you in the panel.
Actually, Omer, before you go, and Kelvin, maybe a quick, Omer, you asked the question, do we have an ambitious agri-food innovation action plan? I think the reality is we don't have any action plan alone, let alone an ambitious one. But I'm curious whether or not, if you look across the economy, are there sectors that do have that plan? Are there places that we should look at to learn from as to who is doing this well?
Right. So there is a critical mineral focused strategy. So that's certainly one of the areas that I know Canada is really trying to move forward. Another one is around artificial intelligence. So that's where I think that strategy is a little getting outdated, in my opinion. That needs a refresh as well in the new context. But so there's been some strategies and action planning around some of those sectors like critical minerals and AI that I see. I think quantum is another one. This is again getting into the commercialization space, a great opportunity for Canada. So some examples there, and I think we can also look at this internationally and see what we can learn from countries like Australia. I think you had a great emphasis on some of your recent work on Australia, and also a country like Netherlands. I think what else we can learn from outside economies and strategies is going to be a good information gathering and sort of consideration exercise for us.
Great. Well, thank you, Omer. Thank you, Kelvin. And Kelvin, we'll bring you back in. Thank you, Omer, for taking the time to join us. And we'll now bring in our three panelists. We'll start with a rapid fire round with Angela Bedard-Haughn and Darcy Pollock and Elizabeth Lika, and then we'll go back to some questions for the panelists. But if we could get all three to come on here at once, we'll start with some questions for all of them. So Angela, Darcy, Elizabeth, my question for you all is, and we'll start, Angela, with you first. Is Canadian agriculture innovation in a crisis?
Not just yet.
Elizabeth, are we in a crisis?
Yes.
Darcy?
A very hesitant no, but we're on the precipice.
So we'll go around again. Angela, go back to you. So you said not yet. Why do you say that?
No, I tend not to be too much of an alarmist. I try to be a bit more of a pragmatic person. I think, could we do better? Of course, absolutely. There's lots of spaces where we are fragmented, but not completely shattered. When I think crisis, we don't have to look too far to see what what research systems in crisis look like. I think we can definitely, though, there's room for improvement, and I hope we're getting closer to that.
Okay. Elizabeth, you said yes. Why do you think that we are?
Yes, and it's not that I want to change my answer, but I said yes because it was a short answer. I want to elaborate a bit on that. I see this more as a quiet kind of crisis, one that is creeping through this underinvestment, like the professor said, fragmentation, these missed opportunities rather than a sudden collapse. And the reason why I lean more toward the yes is because the data that I've seen so far during the initiative really make this evidence clear that we cannot deny that there has been a decline in the public investment, around 21% since the 1980s, or the private investment, which accounts only for a quarter of the total R&D. We have this aging research infrastructure. Add to that the system operating in silos, there's duplicating mandates, and all this evidence, I think it really makes it hard to argue that the system is performing as it should. And whether we call it a crisis, a turning point, or really like the system operating under strain, I think that we can all agree that the system can and should deliver better to the sector. And I understand that there are nuances to this, and different stakeholders that sitting at the different parts of the innovation continuum may experience the severity of these challenges in a different way. So those that are like part of the long-standing research institutions or the commodity groups, they might see the system as functioning reasonably well, but others that are like more in roles of the emerging value chains, they see more as a broken system. And I think it's okay that both perspectives exist, and that's a valid debate. But I think at this moment, what matters is that the evidence shows that really the system, as I said, can and should do better. And rather than framing this as a doom and gloom, I would really more frame this as less a matter of emergency, but more as a choice point for the
Okay.
system.
Thank you. And Darcy, you said that you were hesitant. What made you hesitate in your answer?
Well, I think Omar did a good job of maybe painting the picture of the true situation that we're in. So, let's not discount that. But when I think of innovation, it's really part of a continuum. It starts with research where, Angela's doing a great job. The universities are doing a great job. I think we've got a lot of successes that need to be celebrated. But that continuum goes to development. And I think what you're talking about, Elizabeth, that's a good example of we're really faltering. We haven't done a good job of translation. Omar painted a great picture there, but where I think we are in crisis mode is commercialization. That C that nobody talks about. We haven't done a great job of creating new companies, of supporting startups, getting that to actually come into the fold of sort of the larger market.
Great, thank you. So let's now start to dive a little bit deeper even more, and I'll take a minute to introduce Angela. Angela Bedard-Haughn is the Dean and Professor at the College of Agriculture and Bioresources at the University of Saskatchewan. And she earned her BSc there and Master's before completing her PhD in soil science at UC Davis. As a scholar teacher, her research focuses on wetland soils and predictive soil mapping. But Angela, I would imagine as Dean, you focus on a lot of the challenges and opportunities of running a university. And I want to start there. I think we've heard when you listen to the news, the challenges facing universities across Canada. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what those challenges are, what they mean for the role that academia is going to play in the future, and how agriculture compares to other parts of the university.
Okay. Yeah, so when we think about what's happening with universities writ large, certainly we hear a lot about the reductions in funding. And so we hear about reductions in funding at the provincial level. And so a lot of universities are being required to think about how they can contract or do more with less. That has been compounded in recent years with some of the changes in terms of how we can recruit international students, so with some of the caps. And one of the toughest parts about that, in particular for places like Saskatchewan, is that we still have lots of capacity for international students, but the global messaging as a function of that, it's created a very chilling effect. So while our numbers shouldn't be going down, they are, just because less international students are even applying. And so we're definitely seeing that compounding some of those financial challenges. And then you add to that, that contraction. And one of the points that Elizabeth made, we've got most of our universities have aging infrastructure. And when we think about agriculture in particular, it tends to be a very infrastructure intensive space to do research in, right? It's not just a matter of going and sitting in our office and, thinking big thoughts. Most of the research that we're doing requires significant land, field, laboratory resources, animal care facilities, and all of that is very expensive both to maintain and to run, especially if you want to be doing that at a level that is relevant to industry, not just even current with industry, but looking at where industry should be headed, looking ahead. So there's a lot of costs there, and there's not been as many opportunities as historically for ways to bolster that investment in those facilities.
And how does that, so when you're thinking about kind of that broader university family that you operate in and that your counterparts in the Dean's Council operate in, how does that kind of that cost intensive nature of ag research impact kind of your ability to compete with deans in our medicine faculty or in other sciences? I mean, what does that play out, and how do people think about the way that ag, or the role that ag research plays in the university?
Yeah, there's kind of two components to that. I mean, in Saskatchewan, agriculture is essential, right? And so, when the University of Saskatchewan was established, it was to provide, knowledge for the people of Saskatchewan at that time. What they really needed was agriculture knowledge. And so we've been a really cornerstone faculty within the University of Saskatchewan throughout our history, including we used to have a better farming train. Literally, faculty would get on a train and go across the prairies and do extension to folks, because we couldn't do webinars back then. And so it's always been part of our ethos. But yeah, as the financial situation has gotten tighter, there's kind of been a twofold piece. I mean, one, we've also been really fortunate here in Saskatchewan to have good partnership with commodity groups and with our provincial Ministry of Agriculture. And so in some cases, the university looks at that and goes, okay, well, we'll let them take care of you. We're going to go over here and spend more of our resources on people that don't have good partnership with industry. But at the same time, we continue to be a really important part of the university's strength and identity. And we are the most research intensive college on this campus. And so, and I think that's, for some of our counterparts, that's the case. In some of the universities, though, the ag colleges can be a bit more of a have-not situation, just by virtue of the other competing needs. It's a mixed bag, but it's definitely we have to hustle hard with our partners to get things done. We're lucky here to have good partners, but if you didn't have that, we would be in a very rough place indeed.
But the partnership piece is where I wanted to go next, because I think it's one of the things that we hear a lot about academia is kind of the disconnect that can exist between farmers on the ground and their needs and what they're looking for, and the academics that are in these proverbial ivory towers that don't see there. How do you kind of respond to that perception, and what does that kind of interface between academics and the industry and farmers look like for the future of the R&D and innovation in Canada?
Yeah, I think that would be a great example to your earlier point of the difference among different faculties, right? And so I think that maybe is true for some of my colleagues across campus and in other faculties who don't have the same kind of connection to industry. I have talked to researchers from non-agricultural faculties. They're like, oh man, I just wish I could talk to a farmer. And I'm thinking, like, how many have I talked to this week? And I always chuckle when I think about the ivory tower, because I'm pretty sure nobody's ivory tower smells like a researcher just walked back from the dairy barn. And my elevator usually smells like somebody's just come from doing an experiment in the dairy barn. So it's just the notion of that separation is I don't think as strong in a lot of the faculties of agriculture. And so, but it's definitely a problem more broadly, and just the way communication rolls now. People say, well, researchers are disconnected and they're in the ivory tower, and then that becomes the universal truth, kind of forgetting that's not the way it is all the way across the board. I have a lot of my faculty who routinely get phone calls on their office lines from farmers asking questions about management. And so that disconnect is not a universal thing. Can continue to do better always, of course, but I think part of that is just a message that's been overgeneralized.
Okay, great. So I want to dive deeper into this, but we'll bring our other panelists in. So thank you, Angela, for diving a bit deeper on this. And next we'll bring in Darcy Pollock. So Darcy, we'll bring you back. Darcy is the CEO of Nucleus Consulting, which oversees now the wheat growers in his capacity as executive director. Darcy also works for various growth stage companies across North America. He is an accomplished agribusiness leader with over 2 decades of experience across corporate, commercial, and startup sectors, advancing innovation, technology adoption, and ag policy to help producers sustainably feed a growing world amid climate and market volatility. So, Darcy, you now work with producers, but as your bio says, you've worked at AgWest Bio in the past. You've worked with Syngenta. You've been involved with a pretty innovative weather forecasting company. We heard from Omer earlier the challenges around fragmentation across the innovation continuum. We talked about that earlier when we were talking about challenges. Can we go a bit deeper, and can you give us some more of your perspective around the feedback loop that exists or doesn't between the R, the D, and the C, and what we need to do to make that work better?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, again, Omar painted a fantastic picture of it. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is if we look at the environment in the United States, a large part of the funding for ag tech, but all technology startups happens in around the Boston, Massachusetts area and Silicon Valley. And you look at what we have as a benefit in Canada, and the proximity to farmers tends to be very close, right? So the U of S is maybe one of the better examples of very close proximity, but I get phone calls from the University of Toronto, UBC, other institutions, and they reach out, they want to know. And so if I can answer questions, I certainly do. At the same token, our directors are always ready to have a conversation, tell them what it's kind of really like on the ground and the problems that they have and the needs that they want. So, and I think companies have done a good job of instituting grower panels, right? So we have a number of members and directors that sit John Deere and help them with their innovation. I think proximity isn't necessarily a problem in Canada, or at least not comparatively. But when we kind of think about, our successes, we have to, and this is where I had the nuance of no, I don't think so. We've got a lot, like ag machinery is a great example of an area where we've got, companies Burgo and Seedmaster and Raven. Like there's lots of good examples of the things that have come out of farmers. And I also do a little bit of work with the Canadian Outstanding Young Farmers, and every single one of them have innovated in some way to help their operation thrive. So, I don't want to downplay it. It's certainly something that we want to work on. But we've got stark contrasts. And I don't know, for those of you or anyone that's been to World Agri-Tech Summit, I mean, you can see the stark difference between what we have as an advantage in Canada compared to some of the jurisdictions that don't have that kind of a benefit.
But Darcy, one of the challenges that we face on this issue, maybe on a lot of issues, is that, yes, farmers are innovative. You talked about those outstanding young farmers who are probably real leaders in this. Yes, we've got companies that are doing well, but at the same time, there's this opportunity gap that seems to exist, right, between how well we should be doing, or we often kind of bask in how things were before. I mean, I think if you look at we celebrate the invention of canola, but that wasn't yesterday. So Darcy, how do you think through kind of this difference between acknowledging, yes, that we do have an innovative sector, but admitting that the sector is not as innovative as it could be, and that there are these big kind of barriers standing in the way from achieving that full potential?
So you're absolutely right, and I only just talked about one of the many ingredients that it takes to be successful when it comes to realizing the benefits of innovation. And one of the places that I definitely think that we falter is around what my friend Shane Thomas, and he talks about this in Upstream Ag, is the difference between finite and infinite games. Okay, and so the real crux behind that is we've been struggling to create companies, and the thing about those companies is that when they're successful, or maybe they have an exit, is you have a tendency for that founder and that CEO to come back into the fold and provide angel investment and provide the know-how of scaling and finding venture capital and having a network to tie into. I would say that we're pretty severely lacking in that regard, and it's unfortunate. And you nailed the last one before you came on, talking about where's the national strategy. Where's that leadership that helps everybody kind of come together, provide that prioritization, and then the funding and everything else comes with it. But sometimes we do need that encouragement, and I couldn't agree with you more that that's been one of the missing pieces as well.
And so, Darcy, you've worked with kind of small, medium, and large multinational companies over the years. Now, I'm curious just to kind of what's your experience around kind of what are the similarities and what are the differences between innovation and kind of in a small business in Saskatoon that you're working with at AgWest Bio versus at Syngenta as a large multinational corporation? What's the same and what's different?
It's easy to say that there'd be maybe big differences because you might think about size as probably the predominant factor that might make it easier or harder. But I think one of the stats that really stuck out to me as I was kind of searching for it's the rationale is we rank 35th out of 38th for regulatory burden in OECD countries. Like that is a monstrous number. And we've seen it in practice, the effects that it's had. And this is an example that's been, well talked about over the last little while is Vive crop protection, taking 7 years for a technology that came out of the University of Guelph, so made in Canada, taking 7 years in Canadian regulatory process to get through versus 2 in the United States. So of course they go there, they commercialize there, they get their experience there, they hire the people there, they build and continue to innovate there. And I think it's a good example of, and I don't want to chastise anybody. It's not like the regulators don't keep us safe, but they're sort of creating a fair bit of blockade. The other part of it it's the same, just different scale is certainly the dollars. So when you're in a multinational company, you have to compete with all the different countries and you have to compete with all the different crops in order for your solution or your new innovation to be funded. And it's a global game. And so they might be talking about the hundreds of millions of dollars. Whereas if you're a startup, it might be the fives or the tens of millions of dollars. And so this is another place where we've got a pretty stark contrast between Canada and the United States, where sort of that liquidity, or it's more easily available to go from an idea to $10 million. Whereas in Canada, you go through IRAP and you go through all the different programs and they sprinkle just small amounts of money in order for you to continue to kind of reach that next hurdle. Whereas it's quite a bit of a different approach in the United States. So it's something that I think we need to improve on as well.
Great. Thank you, Darcy. And I think we'll come back to that comment about regulatory burden later, and I'm appearing before the Agriculture Committee with Vive later this afternoon. So we'll be some good food for thought. So I'd like to bring in our last panelist. That is Elizabeta Lika. We're quite pleased to have Elizabeta on our webinar this afternoon. Elizabeta is a research associate here at CAPI. She leads and contributes to research on ag policy issues like innovation, R&D, sustainability. She also serves on the board of directors of the Canadian Agricultural Economics Society and is a junior research fellow with the NATO Association of Canada. Elizaveta, quite happy to have you on the webinar this afternoon. You recently authored a report that's called At a Turning Point, Canada's Agriculture R&D. Why don't you share with us what the report says and kind of what the turning point you think that we are at is?
Yes, thank you, Tyler. Yes, very happy that I finally get to complain and share my thoughts with other people beyond you. I feel like I've talked a lot about R&D to myself. So this report really starts with a simple but very important premise that meaningful progress really cannot begin without having an honest picture of where the ag R&D system begins. And before proposing fixes and solutions, we thought that the sector will really benefit from a shared understanding of where the challenges are and from a clarity whether this current approach still fits the future of today, but most importantly, the needs and emerging priorities of tomorrow. So the report really seeks to make the stakeholders and the audience reflect on several key questions, such as, are the problems well understood? Should we really consider the status quo? Are the incentives in place the right to make the system really deliver the best and in an effective way for the sector? How should the geopolitical realities, the current fiscal reality environment that we live in shape the path as we move forward? So as Darcy and you mentioned, yes, we acknowledged in the report all the successes of the ag R&D system, the canola rise, the dairy productivity, the decades of crop innovation, but at the same time, it's very important, and that's what the report tends to do. It's very important to understand that the operating context has changed. And while all the successes are real and great job, we should take pride of them, it's so important to understand that there are so many other challenges. As I don't want to repeat all of them, but we have this weak research to farm pathways. We have this lack of coordination, duplicating mandates, that really make all these structural pillars of the system really be shaky. So this is what the turning point really in terms of the report means. And the report aims to frame the discussion toward not having another conference, another webinar really to talk about the problems or what's wrong with the system, but to reframe the question to how can we best move forward knowing what we know right now. So this is on a high level the purpose of the report as a starting point.
And as you've kind of dug into this, what surprised you of the research? What weren't you expecting that you found out?
My biggest surprise was actually that the challenges that we have identified in the report are not new. So the more I dived into the research process, I realized that the challenges that we were talking about, that I was identifying, they were like the fragmentation, which is one of the biggest challenges of the system highlighted across different evidence. Those were maybe in isolation, but they were highlighted in different audit reports and different evaluations and different assessments. And what surprised me was not that we found them again, that is great, but was that despite that unfortunately consistent pattern of evidence and challenges, the conversation seems to not move past beyond acknowledging these challenges. And I mean, despite my idealistic hope and willingness for the system to move forward, I understand that structural changes are difficult and it takes a lot of shared ownership, a lot of long-term commitment. It takes a lot of difficult choices about changing the leadership and changing roles. But this was striking that there are the challenges are clear, and we like it or not, even stakeholders are aware of them in different capacity, but the conversation tends to end there. And this is how I see our initiative, and this as a moment that hopefully will make that difference, will keep the conversation going and moving so that, as I said, we reframe the question from what's wrong and we're not unlucky to how we can do better and move forward.
And I think, Elizaveta, that was one of my surprises, was how much awareness or agreement there seemed to be that we had structural issues. And so the report that we put out reflects that. I suppose a report that will be coming out soon reflects some survey work that you did, where respondents pretty clearly communicated that they agree that structural change is needed. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts around the role of government in that change. And I think often we have this issue with kind of where does government play on the innovation continuum, recognizing that it should be different you're talking about basic R&D, or you're talking about commercialization. But when it comes to this broader leadership issue, where do you think government should be playing?
I think Omer and also Darcy, they pointed to that lack of leadership. And of course, like everybody, who doesn't love money? But through the survey and through the workshop, the roundtables that we've had with the other stakeholders, it really seems that the funding purpose of the government isn't the top priority or the top expectation that the stakeholders are waiting for government. They really see the role of the government as being more effective when it comes to leadership. And it does make sense because of all the fragmented and the working in silos and the misaligned incentives that are in place. So they see the government coming in, playing an effective role as an enabler, as someone that really builds the condition and creates the condition for that effective collaboration. And of course, there is a role for the government to fund that high-risk, long-term science, also to really make possible that the public good research capacity is out there, the one that the private market maybe cannot sustain. But most importantly is that leadership and really setting those directions and then bringing everyone else along on board with clear regulatory, with that speed to meet the needs. And like the Netherlands example that Omer provided, or the Australia example, how the government really goes in and co-funds the early stage high risk partnerships, really creates that environment and changes that philosophy that the government is sitting back and waiting for directions and then just providing the money.
Right, and I think that's something where I think often there's a perception that when government wants to lead, it means government has to dictate or say, and I don't think that's what you're saying, right? It's not about government should tell everyone what the research agenda is, but government needs to be able to more clearly communicate what role it will play in that ecosystem and how it will move things forward. And Elizabeth, as we bring Angela and Darcy back in, I'll start with you on kind of this next group discussion. And I think ultimately, if you're talking about is the system in a crisis, there's, I think, a premise there that you will know what the system needs to be doing and whether or not it's doing it or not. And so Elizabeth, what do you think? How should we be measuring success in the ag innovation system in Canada?
So the way that the incentives and the system is structured right now, it seems that it's incentivizing or measuring success in terms of the activity, the number of patents, the number of research publications, which they all are important and they have their own role. But what I saw across the survey responses is that really stakeholders more and more, they want measurable outcomes. If at the end of the day, if the innovation is it's not used, what's the worth, what's the benefit of it? So the success of the R&D system is seen more as productivity, as technology adoption, as environmental performance. So more there's measurable outcomes. And of course, again, there are nuances, there are disagreements, but I think that waiting for a perfect and really uniform agreement, let's choose one success measure, that might kill the momentum. And I think we should come to a point that be comfortable with what we have. And if users of it are saying that we want technology adoption as one of the measures and one of the successes, I think that should be enough to move forward, good enough to move forward.
So Angela, what are your thoughts on how we should be measuring success in innovation?
Well, I think there are some of those quantitative things that we've been pointing to as signs that we're going backwards, right? Like the amount of investment that we've been putting into it. I definitely agree with what Elizabeth was saying in terms of the adoption piece. Can we get to the stage where we're not just innovating, but actually keeping those ideas and developing those ideas in the companies in Canada, as opposed to just, hey, here's a great idea. How quickly can we get it into the US so that it can flourish down there? And I think, honestly, one of the more subjective ways we'll know is that there will be less of that Groundhog Day. Hopefully, we'll stop having the exact same conversation over and over again about what are the innovation challenges and the innovation gaps, and we can shift the needle that way. So if it feels like we're having even a slightly different conversation, or the reports show slightly different outcomes, that would be progress as well.
Yeah, I think you're setting the bar low, Angela, but yeah, it seems that might even be hard to achieve some days. I don't know, Darcy, what are your thoughts? How do we measure success in ag innovation?
I think I go default to, and Omar mentioned that we were at 2% productivity, not so long ago. We were actually at 3% productivity in the earlier 2000s and now falling below 1%. So, I mean, let's use those metrics, but let's not ignore them, much to what Angela is kind of talking about here. And competitiveness is the other one. Our competitiveness as a nation, and we've been falling. It's been falling at a rate that's starting to become troublesome, right? And this is why we're kind of on this precipice. We also have to recognize that innovation isn't just about bringing research through to commercialization. It has to do with trade. It has to do with the reliability of our ability to get the products that we're creating to market. So yeah, it's a bigger ecosystem, as you were saying, that we really need to focus in on.
But if you think about that kind of bigger ecosystem, Darcy, how it seems like we're shrinking, right? I think if you look at those business R&D expenditure numbers that we talked about earlier, like it seems like we're not necessarily going in the right direction there. Is part of the challenges that we've got that we're not actually building one ecosystem in Canada, but we're trying to build kind of 10 ecosystems that we haven't really figured out how to do, kind of building at scale nationally. Is that part of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple different ways to sort of paint the picture. I'm in Ottawa this week and doing a little bit of lobbying here on the Hill as part of Grains Week with grain growers. And so part of our job is to help inspire our elected officials and really help them to kind of understand what's going on. And one of the key figures that we have is Agriculture Agri-Food Canada's went from 860 million to 680. So a 20% reduction over just over 10 years. And now we're being faced with, I think you guys mentioned this, right? Another 15%. That's another $100 million. And so, yeah, we can celebrate canola. We've done pulses. We have a lot of successes. But, I took advantage of the time and asked a few of our leaders, what's next? And we don't really seem to have that identified. So yeah, I agree. We need to start collaborating. We have to have, the conversation about what it's going to take. And, the way to first solve a problem is admit you have one. So at least maybe we're on the right track.
But Darcy, is part of the problem not that, again, producer groups tend to focus on government spending and support for the sector, but what's been falling faster and further is private R&D investment? Like, Darcy, how come we can't get more of a focus on that as an issue and less on just more government spending as the solution?
Sometimes, and other people have sort of said it, it's just setting the baseline and helping to kind of unlock some different ideation, train the people that are going to be innovative. I already sort of touched on regulations as being such a monstrous competitive disadvantage. But we do have to realize, it is a competitive environment out there. We are getting outcompeted by a lot of jurisdictions. Angela, it's tough, right? In Canada, we're 25. There's the best university is 25th. We've only got 7 in the top 100. The US has 10 out of the top 20, right? So yeah, it is about funding, but we have to be able to generate the expertise and we have to be able to encourage it and have intellectual property tools that incentivize it. So, I don't want to reiterate all the things that Omar said, but he nailed it on a lot of fronts.
And Angela, Darcy just talked about competition. I'm curious, when you think about kind of the landscape that you're in at the University of Saskatchewan, who are you competing with and kind of what impact does that have in the R&D space?
I think sometimes one of the challenges we actually face, and maybe this is more of a broad component or part of the challenge that we face as a country, is that question is harder to answer than it should be. Basically, there's been a lot of growth and excitement in the agriculture space, but I think a lot of us feel like we have to be all things to all people, and that is only making this challenge worse in terms of that lack of coordination or the challenge of commercialization. Because at one point it was relatively clear, like, this is what NRC does, this is what Ag Canada does, this is what universities do, this is what the colleges or tech schools do. And there's all those Venn circles have gotten bigger and bigger over time, to the point where it's confusing for us, it's confusing for investors. Where does everybody fit? Who's doing what? And I think that means we're not making as good of a use of those limited resources as we could be as a function of that. And so, yeah, in terms of who we're competing with, there's there's so many different ways I could answer that question depending on what it is that we're talking about. And I keep thinking back to the AgRise group that's led by the Ag and Vet Deans Council of Canada. And one of the key findings coming out of the AgRise report that we did last year was that innovation is strong, but coordination and commercialization are weak. So it's not that we're not doing the work, but it's just the system is almost crowded or cluttered, and it's not sure, what's this institute supposed to be doing versus that government organization versus that NGO versus this university or that university. And I think that makes it harder for everybody. So that's that national strategy we're talking about, that national kind of perspective and coordinating role is, I think, really one of the missing pieces.
And Angela, so how do you fix that, right? So again, fragmentation is a word that's come up kind of over and over again. You just talked about kind of its own, yes, it's fragmentation, but that leads to overlap and duplication and the lack of coherence. It seems unrealistic to ask the participants that are involved in that overlap and duplication to kind of self-identify what they're not going to do anymore in order to reduce that. But how do you see us getting past that? Where does that kind of leadership come from?
That's the $1 million question, right? And I think that's why we're stuck. That's why we're in Groundhog Day, because the number of meetings, and I know, Tyler, you and I have been at a lot of those same meetings, we get to this point where we're pretty sure we need this. We need this clarifying strategy. We need this roadmap. Who's going to do it? And everybody's sitting on their hands. Well, not me, right? And it doesn't seem to matter who's in the room. It's not clear who should be leading that, and arguably this is a role for the federal government, but there's some inherent challenges with turning that accountability over to the federal government as well, especially when we start talking about some of those regional differences. I think ultimately we need to think about what a confederated role structure might look like. But yeah, I think there has to be some. A lot of times it's money will talk, and it's saying, okay, well, this particular program is not now open to absolutely everybody. We think this is work that should be done by government organizations. This is work that should be done by universities. This is work that should be done by some of the colleges, and starting to think about it that way, because I honestly don't know how else you move the needle in that space.
And Elizabeth, this is something, right, that I think you've heard pretty consistently, that you've seen in all of the work that we do, right? There is this yearning for kind of that coherence or that strategy, that some of that direction and collaboration. What are you kind of hearing from the stakeholder community that we talk to in our work about the need for what Angela just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately I don't have an answer either, but the agreement seems to be that there is this desire and appetite for change, and appetite for collaboration. Is it difficult? Of course it is, and it's easier said than done. So I don't know if that appetite for change comes because deep inside stakeholders, they know that nothing is going to change, so they still will keep moving with the status quo. But really, it seems that this leadership in changing the incentives, as long as the incentives in place won't change, I think for sure the system outcomes won't change. So we will keep going in these circles and having this kind of discussions. And really, one guiding principle that seems to be needed in the conversations is, what do we want out of R&D? Do we want it a silver bullet solution, or do we want it to solve just the short-term needs of the sector? Should it serve the farmers? Should it serve the future generations? As I was reading the notes last night, I just came across a quote that I had saved somewhere. If a man plants a tree that he knows he will never sit in, that means that he found the purpose in life. And I don't know if this should be the purpose of the Ag R&D, to serve the future generations, and I don't know what that would mean and translate for stakeholders today, but certainly that leadership of the government should come, and we should acknowledge that we cannot make everyone happy. Trade-offs will be there. So setting the roles, not dictating outcomes, but setting the roles and the directions, harmonized directions, is something that the sector seems to want.
But Elizabeth, you probably didn't intend this, but I think one of the realities about that planting of the tree also reflects like the lag time, right? Like it is the work that's happening in universities today will potentially take decades or more to get from kind of that early stage research through the innovation continuum to adoption from someone else. How much of that is inherently the challenge that kind of, especially in the political policy world, that where people want solutions like tomorrow, but that's actually not kind of the right way to think about kind of where innovation's at. Darcy, maybe come to you on this kind of same one after, but
yeah, that is definitely a challenge, and I think I'm contradicting myself in here because previously I said that one of the successes of the R&D system should be adoption, and that would translate into the short-term projects and basically what the system looks now, like how it incentivizes competition for limited funding and for deadlines and for this short-term outcomes. And on the other hand, we also want the longer foundational science and the innovation that maybe the future generations will benefit from. So that is where the government is trying the best. And in the conversations that I've had with government officials, I really, I felt like I was biased a bit before going into the conversations and thinking that they're not trying the best, but I think they're trying. They're trying as hard as they can. And sometimes it seems this, rather than a lack of willingness, really like an attempt to satisfy everyone. So, and that makes it challenging. And
Darcy, is that part of the problem that we've got governments trying to make everybody happy? I mean, it's what?
Well, that's part of a larger probably conversation, but I think the thing that we're kind of lacking is, and I don't I don't want to have to rely on the federal government or any layer of government for this to come to fruition. But one of the things that we're lacking is we don't have an Elon Musk, and I don't mean the controversial version of that, but we don't have somebody that's just taking the bull by the horns and saying, I'm just doing it. I'm going to pump a lot of money into whatever it is that I have passion for, and we're going to change the world. But it's why that example of creating a crop and is so pivotal for being able to kind of remind us how good we can be at that. And so sometimes you do have to kind of have, the government play a part. And maybe I do believe that one of the programs that worked out pretty good with the clusters, Protein Industries Canada and what Bill Grewal did there and how they really tried to kind of connect everybody, right? So it was really just realizing it's not just the government. So they put a lot of dollars in. And the other thing that they were willing to do is get it wrong every now and then. Not every one of those investments really worked out. But it was pretty focused, and you can argue whether you agree with the area of focus or not, but we at least chose a few places where we wanted to win. And then we, kind of tried to enable it as best we can.
And Angela, how hard? I mean, that is the world that when you're doing that kind of that early stage research, right? That's kind of the issue all of the time, right? Is how are you going to deploy those resources? How are we doing on that and kind of picking the right places to invest in that early stage R&D?
I think that is one of the spaces where having close connections with industry is really important. And so, here we work with the Ag Development Fund through the Provincial Ministry of Agriculture, and all those funding decisions that are made there are informed by this board that includes a whole bunch of industry representation, right? The different commodity groups and so on. And so those folks sit around the table and they go, okay, where are we going to invest in this? And if it's not going to make a difference for agriculture, we're not going to invest in it, right? And so it really drives in that space. But I think one of the points that Darcy made that I wanted to double down on is just that risk, that willingness to, within the funding space, there needs to be that willingness to try some things and know that not everything's going to work out. And that's that's a challenging space when we're already, in an industry with such tight margins, and and it takes so much longer for new innovations to be truly field tested. And then we've got, even if you're trying to field test something, is it going to work the same in this part of the prairies versus that part of the prairies versus Ontario, or in 2021 versus 2025, right? Like there's so many variables that make this so much trickier. And so, when we're thinking about how we design things, certainly in our research programs, we're like, okay, here's this element where we try and pare away as much of the variables as we can to take away that noise. But it's part of why it takes so long, is that there's all these other variables before something can be meaningfully deployed at scale. And even then, what works well in the prairies is not necessarily going to work well in BC or Ontario.
And I think one of the challenges that we've got in Canada today, and I think to a certain extent in ag innovation around the world, is that we don't have that same, like there is a need for those public dollars to do some of the kind of the early stage riskier work. And I think sometimes we don't appreciate the role that, especially in the United States, and the defense, what is it, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Production Agency, has taken public dollars and invested in early stage work, really innovative, cutting edge stuff that the private sector is not investing in, and that's got us the internet, among other things. I'm curious, is Darcy, maybe go to you on this. How do we kind of again understand how do we innovate within the innovation system so that we can create kind of new tools for government, private sector, others to get better outcomes, better results? How do we kind of create more of a space to do things differently?
Omer talked a little bit about network, right? And creating that connectivity between all the different groups. And, the goal is never groupthink. It's really to be able to challenge each other. And I would say that sometimes we're a little too nice in Canada. The Canada nice adage maybe dissuades us from challenging each other's to the extent where we can actually really truly get some breakthroughs and kind of argue about what the future ought to be and really be audacious. I don't see those big, hairy, audacious goals coming to the forefront and saying, how are we going to tackle it? And if we do a better job of, I'm not advocating for anybody, but there's a number of different institutions or organizations. Most provinces have them. Saskatchewan Ag West Bio, there's Bio Alberta, Bio Enterprise, Emily. I try to get most of them, Mars. But the point is, like, we've got those, but if you keep in mind, they're all kind of provincial. And so the other kind of thing that we really have to jump over our own kind of hurdle is, those provincial barriers of, we talk about, I forget the government is trying to break down the interprovincial trade. Well, we kind of have interprovincial competition problem as well. So the more that we can network, the more that we can communicate and challenge each other to tackle big problems, I think the better off we'll be.
And Elizabeth, one of the questions that's come on from the audience speaks to that network issue, and they talk. Question is have we looked at kind of insights from the energy sector based on how they created those national coordinating roles? And so they use a couple of examples of Clean Resource Innovation Network, for example, as something that the energy sector has done. Have we started to look at that, and where do you kind of think that plays around the need to kind of create these networks, and what lessons can we learn?
So at the point where the R&D initiative is at this moment, we really haven't started to look at the other sectors, but as we try to work on a draft framework that the Ag-Rise working group has developed on how to really create that 21st century system, R&D system, I think going to other examples, to the energy sector or also to other countries, I think is very helpful. And because the challenges that we identified in the ag R&D and the ag sector are not unique to the sector, that means that really we shouldn't try to reinvent the science. So looking at the other examples, if we have domestically other successful examples, why not to look and adapt them? But at this point, we're really trying to build that momentum to acknowledge the challenges and to really decide if we should move forward or maybe there is no problem out there. So we should let the things keep going as they are.
Angela, universities often come up as a bit of an example of this kind of challenge of provincial silos. And again, we talk about fragmentation and duplication, and it's a flippant answer or flippant question maybe, but But how come we need a kind of a research dairy barn in every province in this country? How do we fix that problem?
I think one of the things that we talk about at the Ag and Vet Dean's table, with respect to that question, is remembering that universities do have two roles as well. So there's the research and the teaching piece. And so, for example, our dairy barn, yes, we do research in it, but it's also where we do teaching. And so, are we going to when it's time for that field trip, right? Or there we go. Our students get the opportunity of going and working in the dairy and doing that hands-on training as part of their not just as graduate students, but also as part of their undergraduate training. Same thing with really any of our animal facilities. And so there's that piece. It's remembering that most of our units are research and teaching units, and so that's part of what we're looking for there. And then otherwise, there are some regional differences, honestly, even in some of those spaces in terms of having the norms of practice, and and those relationships. Our dairy guys are saying, yeah, we really do want to know how we could do better in Saskatchewan. It's not, we don't have the same kind of, we don't grow the same kind of crops. We don't do things exactly the same as they do in Quebec. So, how can we make sure that our needs, our research needs and our research questions are being answered? And from their perspective, it's important to have their own local dairy barn. But yeah, that's definitely a debate that we've had time and again, and figuring out what are the things that need to be, if we have that, are there spaces where we can specialize as well? We're having that conversation right now in the laying hen space. Manitoba just built a new laying hen barn. We're looking at one. How can we make sure that ours has, what features can help us answer questions that maybe they can't at University of Manitoba, while still allowing for those common elements as well.
Calvin, laying hens is a good time to bring you back in. You're a chicken guy, but Calvin, what are your thoughts and what are your questions for the panelists?
I guess one issue I see, and I know this discussion is about shaping an overall ecosystem, kind of from an overall arching policy perspective. But if I put my farmer hat on, I think a lot of R&D and innovation happens in farmers' shops and happens in small businesses, maybe not necessarily measured. And I think often the success stories are where there's coordination between things that happen on university campuses together with that kind of that real world application. And I know uh, we are seeing more examples of smart farms, and Darcy alluded to a list of some of the organizations that are working on practical implementation and kind of making that connection at the farm level. I guess I just wonder whether well, I guess there's two questions, and I know Tyler and I have debated this in the past, and I'm going to maybe have a bit of a contrary perspective here, but I worry a little bit about government picking winners and losers in terms of if we have a centralized agency that focuses on research and development, how do they choose which projects to invest in and which ones not to, and whether that's the best approach to that. And then I also wonder who's going to fund that, or how do we, given the economics, especially on the crop side of things right now, how do we incentivize investment in that final commercialization stage that Darcy also alluded to, there being challenges with where we have innovation happening, but it's a matter of actually getting it onto the farm level. So maybe there's two different questions, and then I'll just throw it to the panel for feedback on those thoughts.
Angela, do you want to go first? Again, this difference between needing leadership and coherence, but not wanting to pick winners and losers?
Yeah, that's where when I mentioned earlier, what would it look like to have some sort of a confederated approach? Because, even if I just think about some of the Western perspectives and, the Western alienation, and there would be immediate, that's part of what I was thinking of is, there'd be this immediate concern that if we have a solely federal approach to this, that it would be very Ontario-centric, and that, and that might create further tensions. And so, what might a bit more of a distributed but coordinated approach, and so that's why I'm trying to use the word coordination as opposed to directing, because I think there are some of these differences that need to be acknowledged, and that requires distributing some of that accountability, but still having somebody with that bigger lens who can help bring all those pieces back together and make sure that, hey, this good idea maybe was developed in the prairies, and I don't think it'll work in BC, but let's try it out in Nova Scotia or whatever, right? So thinking about that confederated approach rather than a entirely central top-down kind of perspective.
But Darcy, your thoughts on this? And again, maybe I'll say that like there are examples of this. This is not kind of rocket science, right?
So I'm going to try to stay positive here. So when I came back into the fold after being in various other countries trying to commercialize products, I came back in and I think there was 5 different consultations underway across all the different, regulatory agencies and sections and sectors of agriculture. And what struck me was that they were all sort of couched in versions of the status quo. And it didn't really allow for some really outside of the box thinking to come into the play to maybe solve some of the problems. We have red tape reduction going on right now. And we've talked about, we keep coming up with the same solutions and they're not doing anything about it. So, I don't know if you're inferring that, Tyler's suggesting to pick winners and losers, but I think what we've seen to date is that we always defer, and it's just these little tweaks that don't really move the needle. And in a competitive world, if we're not being aggressive about really trying to figure out what that outcome is that we want to achieve and actually putting some like hard numbers on it, you want more companies, maybe you want 20% less burden, like whatever it is, we haven't done that. And I think that's been a big falling point for Canada. So when it comes to picking winners and losers, I don't know exactly who should do that. I think that's a tricky question, but at some point we've got to do it and we got to get there. And I think that having enough options in play by putting a little mandate in front of any kind of those consultations and asking people questions, that might really help to get us there.
And before we go to Elizabeth on this, I'll just say Kelvin often has been known to put some words in my mouth, and I may just say very loudly and clearly, I don't think government needs to pick winners and losers, but inherently we do pick winners and losers, right? There's only so much money to go around. There's only so many things that we need to do, so that there are choices that need to be made. And to Angela's point around what is that confederated model that allows us to do that, a more thoughtful, coherent way to choices should get some better outcomes at the end of the day. Elizabeth, your thoughts on this, and then we'll do a wrap-up question, and then we'll come back to Kelvin after.
Yeah, I completely agree with Professor Angela when she refers to that coordinated approach and that one stakeholder shouldn't and cannot do it all in an effective way, and how we need this regional adaptation and everything else. And when I refer to the government leadership, I refer more as creating that transparent governance and those predictable funding out like deadlines and horizons, or the regulatory space that really is not that strong that it impedes this improvement and moving forward. And really, as you said, Tyler, eventually I think that there will be funders and losers, but those, rather than picking them up front, they will be revealed through the system. Having that shared purpose and those aligned incentives, I see that a lot as a very important point. And I recall an example from the meat trade regulatory compliance and the interprovincial trade barriers, when during COVID there was this experimentation of the government to really remove the barriers between Ontario and Quebec, if I'm not mistaken. And really at the end of the day, not a lot changed for the businesses. Maybe those that were like close to Quebec's border, they benefited from it, but on a daily basis, businesses continue to like do the work the same and target the same customers as they were doing. So this is what I really mean when I say that that's shared purpose coming from the leadership from Ottawa in a coordinated approach, but also trying not to satisfy everybody, will really help reveal those funders that will benefit the system in a more sustainable way.
And so, Kelvin, before we go back to you for some concluding thoughts, I've got one question to our panelists. If there was one thing you could change in order to make sure that we avert an ag innovation crisis in Canada, what's the one thing you would change? And Angela, we'll go to you first.
I would like to see that agri-food is a clear and consistent priority of our federal government, and not an afterthought.
Thank you, Darcy. What's your one thing?
I'd like us to take big bets on big science, solve big problems.
Okay, and Elizabeth, one thing from you?
Change incentives that are in place.
Great. Thank you to our panelists for each sticking with one thing. That doesn't always work as well when we get to the end of a webinar. Thank you also for taking the time to join us today. Kelvin, let's go to you for some concluding. Well, again, maybe thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Darcy, for being with us. And again, over to you, Kelvin, now for some concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I think our panelists and our opening speaker, I think, have covered this well, and I'm not sure that like this whole discussion, this is what these webinars are about discussing different perspectives and trying to work towards solutions and improving our agricultural community, our industry, and the contribution we make to the Canadian economy. So I think some great points made here, including it sounds like there's some consensus around this idea of having some more collaboration or coordinated approach as to who will lead that. I think that's one of the big questions in terms of next steps. But yeah, lots to think about when it comes to R&D. And again, there's different angles that we could touch on here, whether we're talking geopolitics or economics at the farm level right now. I think those are more headwinds right now, but necessity is the mother of invention as well. So that's where maybe there's opportunity for things to bloom if we're in a heading into a period where return on investment and things like that are really important at the farm level when it comes to innovation. So yeah, lots of different moving parts here, Tyler, and it's a good discussion.
And I worry, Kelvin, that the problem is we're only going to actually change how we work. Even though we may all agree that we need to change, we may only actually change once we're full on in that crisis. And hopefully, again, we can start to try and build some momentum towards let's change proactively before things get worse.
That takes leadership. And right now a lot of people are comfortable, and that's where the status quo has inertia, and you need leadership to avoid getting into that full-fledged crisis to bring it back to that question.
Yes, and I would like to thank everybody for joining us. This ended up being, I think, our first YouTube live stream. We ran into some technical issues, and I'd like to thank the CAPI team for working to address those, and for those people that joined us on YouTube to watch it live, for evolving and innovating with us on the fly as we did. This will be available on YouTube for everyone else, and we do encourage you to share it, and stay tuned for the next webinar in our ongoing series in partnership with Real Agriculture. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a great day.